We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. I do know Mr. Kelly's on his way up. He'll be here in 1 second. As we call the meeting to order, just one quick agenda update. Because we have a couple of items that has some community interest and citizens here tonight, we may rearrange our committee schedule. We may move down zoning 1 or 2 slots and one of the other committees up 1 or 2 slots just to get to community items earlier in the agenda. Before we call roll, I do have a couple quick things. I've been asked by board members just to mention the following. I know we have a number of citizens here tonight. Thank you very much for your interest in things we're talking about. I'm going to ask that you help me enforce some of our own rules here. Is when you're happy with things you hear said tonight, I'm going to ask that you don't cheer, because then the opposite becomes true, where we're reacting in a negative way when we hear things we don't like. I need your help to enforce the rules that the board set in place. On the same level, I've been asked by board members to remind ourselves only one board member has the floor at one time. We will give you our entire attention when you do have the floor. So with that, I will ask the clerk to go ahead and call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May I also remind everyone, when you speak, please speak clearly into the microphone, and that is for recording purposes. Mr. Kelly.
Here.
Thank you. Mr. McDonald.
Present.
Mr. Neighbors.
Here.
Mrs. Red.
Here.
Mr. Salgado. Mr. Schultz.
Here.
Mr. Tassoni. Mr. Webster.
Here.
Mr. Westcott.
Present.
Mr. Arena.
Here.
Mr. Billich.
Here.
Mr. Booker.
Present.
Mr. Boomer. Mr. Butita.
Here.
Mrs. Crosby.
Here.
Mr. Fellers.
Here.
Mr. Fiducia.
Here.
Mr. Gurl.
Present.
Mrs. Gorel.
Present.
Mr. Hoffman.
Present.
Thank you. 19 present, 1 absent, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much, Clerk Gummow. With that, I will ask everybody to stand, and we'll turn things over to Mr. Fiducia for the invocation and pledge. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, in the spirit of the holiday season. Once in Royal David City stood a lonely cattle shed, where a mother held her baby. We should do well to remember the things he later said. We thank him for this day and ask that he watch over all county employees and their families, and give this board the wisdom to know what is right and the strength to do what is right. Please watch over the police, military, and EMS workers, and all who will be unable to be with their families during this holiday season. In his name, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fiducia. We will move on to public comment. We do have 7 speakers this evening, which is our maximum allowable number of speakers. Our first speaker is David DeBlois. He is from a neighborhood watch group, and he's speaking, I believe, in favor of the question regarding the sales tax referendum. As he's coming up, I'll read our disclaimer. Comments shall be limited to 3 minutes. Speakers may not address a zoning matter which is pending before the ZBA, zoning committee, or the county board. Personnel matters or pending or threatened litigation may not be addressed in open session. An individual may speak a maximum of 3 times per calendar year on the same topic. This prohibition shall include the repetition of the same topic and a statement of what is purported to be a different topic. Personal attacks or inappropriate language of any sort will not be tolerated. David, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chairman Haney and the board. What I'm here to talk about is the landfill, actually. My name is Dave DeBlau. My wife and I have lived at 6906 Meadow Song Trail, Rockford, for the past 29 years. We live approximately 1.5 miles north of the Baxter Road landfill. It is a neat little part of the Rockford area that any of you would enjoy living in. Prior to buying our property, we asked about the landfill sites, as both of them were there long before us. We were told that Pagle Pit was closing as soon as it was filled in another 6 or 7 years, that Ogle County would continue to dump local garbage. Since neither was much of a problem at that time, we happily went along and bought the property. We have thoroughly enjoyed living there. Years went by and we noticed that Pagle Pit did not close as we were told it would. The word expansion became more prevalent. Over the past few years, we have noticed the results of this expansion. The stench of too much garbage being dumped there without the proper gas containment facilities in place, as well as the absolute embarrassment last spring to the city fathers, the whole community, as to the roadway mess left over the winter by hundreds and hundreds of semis hauling garbage to this landfill daily. All of this was allowed to happen because of our county board. I realize you cannot know how the landfill will operate or if it will try and even stay compliant. The board, as well as the companies like Waste Connections, realized that there was money to be made in garbage. Wouldn't business after business, as well as homes built along our southern corridor, have made more sense? I realize that most of you inherited this grenade. You, like us, are stuck with the poor behavior of this landfill owner. You are the members who are starting to sit up and listen to our concerns about the noxious odors, health, and water concerns. How these noxious odors have crept into our homes, making us sick, waking us up in the middle of the night. I do want to say a big thank you to Chairman Haney and Representative Arena for sending letters to the IEPA in Springfield when some of our concerns were brought to your attention. Thank you, Mr. McDonald, when you publicly showed concern for the recent amendment change as not going far enough. Thank you, Mr. Fellers, as publicly acknowledging the appearance that the board was unwilling or unable to help us. You were one of the first that we heard to take a stand for us. Many of you are showing momentum in the right direction. Momentum that I honestly thought I would never see.
Excuse me, sir, we're at the 3-minute mark, so I have to stop you right there. And I do appreciate your comments.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Judge Zeenhoff, speaking on the mental health referendum.
Good evening. I'm here tonight to share information, hopefully to bring a helpful perspective about the challenges, the impact, and the urgency of untreated and even undertreated mental illness in our community and how it affects the justice system. I speak from several vantage points of serving as the presiding judge of the criminal division and the chief judge of the 17th Judicial Circuit. And in these positions, from having convened a 70-person community-wide task force in 2003 to address our jail overcrowding problem, of having led that group of justice and community stakeholders as we educated ourselves with the help of Frank Ware about the impact that persons with untreated mental illness were having on our justice system as they were cycling in and out of the system as if they were in a revolving door. We were not alone. Other communities were experiencing the same thing. Some called it the criminalization of the mentally ill. Former Surgeon General David Satcher called it the silent epidemic. I also bring the perspective of having presided in that mental health court and having served as the national co-chair of the Judges and Psychiatrists Leadership Group and the Illinois Supreme Court Advisory Committee on Justice and Mental Health Planning. Some of the sobering facts I've learned are these. There are 2 million incarcerations of persons with mental illness each year, as reported by the American Psychiatric Association. 17% have a serious mental illness, and 75% of those persons have a co-occurring substance use disorder, while only 5% of the general population have a serious mental illness. Although now we may not have the same jail overcrowding issue in Winnebago County, there are still significantly disproportionate numbers of mentally ill persons in our court system. While judges here in Winnebago County have made systems changes to address this problem and find creative solutions, such as the creation of problem-solving courts and a therapeutic approach rather than traditional criminal case processing. And while the programs in Winnebago County have won many awards and are deemed the gold standard, the truth is we as a court system are ill-equipped to deliver treatment. Moreover, the costs of doing so are added to the costs of operating a court system which is designed to uphold the rule of law. We are still working to find other ways to divert mentally ill persons from the courts, but to what? We must ask that question. The staggering statistic is that over 57% of adults with mental illnesses did not get treatment in the previous year. The reasons are many, and stigma is one, but availability of treatment in this community must be another.
Judge, we were at the 3-minute mark.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge. I would just say, cutting off a community member or a judge is very difficult. The only person with a tougher job, I believe, one of our local mayors had to cut his mom off when she came to speak. And so I apologize, and thank you for helping me enforce our board's rules. Our next speaker is Paul Logley from the United Way, discussing the resolution for the sales tax referendum on mental health.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the county board. I really didn't think I'd ever be up here again working on a referendum. Sheriff Myers and I, of course, worked very hard about 15 years ago to get the 1-cent public safety tax passed. And yet, it was a tough job, and where would we be without that? No jail, less state's attorneys, less public defenders, less probation officers, more people walking the street who should be in jail. We have a similar challenge tonight, and that is the gaps in our mental health services for the people of Winnebago County. We are asking you to move forward tonight to allow a referendum to go on the March primary ballot to give the people of this county a chance to do something that's really important for the adults and children of our community. We know that about 20% of the people in our population are in need of mental health services. Doesn't sound like much, 20%. That probably affects 40 to 60% of our families. It probably affects 100% of our neighborhoods. It affects everybody's quality of life. We have gaps in services for mental health in this community. If you're a child under age 11 and you're in a mental health crisis, and keep in mind children who are suffering with a mental illness, it's like all mental illness, but especially for kids, through no fault of their own. There are no psychiatric services for children under age 11 in this community. Let's load them up in a gurney. Let's take them into Streamwood or Chicago for services. We are asking this board to allow this matter to go to the ballot. If you vote no, you're killing it. If you vote to lay it over, you're minimally delaying it for a couple of years, and you may be killing it anyway. The time is right, the need is great. How many people do we have to lose to suicide? How many people do we have to lose to an overdose? How many kids do we have to lose who will not die, but for the rest of their life they will bear the pain, the unresolved issues of a mental illness? It's not an easy decision. It wasn't easy 15 years ago, but it's the right decision to allow this to move forward, to allow us to form that committee, to get this on the ballot, to give the people of Winnebago County a chance to provide a healthier community, a community with a full spectrum of mental health services. I ask you to vote yes tonight on that resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Logley. Our next speaker, Dick Kunert. Mr. Coonerty is speaking regarding the resolution for the sales tax related to mental health.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here as one of many advocates to ask you, please again, to allow us to put on the ballot in March a resolution to create a mental health board to again provide additional services for our county. For 15 years, I worked with 708 boards in what was our region. So immediately around us, we have 6 counties that have passed 708 legislation, House Bill 708 legislation, where they tax their property for local monies. They've been doing this for 50 years. So the governance model that we have within our resolution has been tested and will work. What would we do with the money if we were able to pass the referendum? We're proponents of the community support program. The community support program has been around for a while, but it was developed from research. It still represents best practice. We have clinicians in this community who know what and how to do things with the target populations that we're looking at, the mentally ill children and adults, and also addicted people. And then the question, is there a need? I was part of the Citizens Advisory Committee to this board when we did a study to look at needs throughout the county. And clearly the answer came back that there was in fact a need for services for your constituents, for services for mental illness and also for their addictions. More recently, the Health Council conducted a poll and again found that more than 50% of the people polled would in fact be supportive of increasing their taxes, a sales tax, to pay for additional services within the county. And interestingly, if you put in the question about restricted money to make sure that any monies raised would in fact be spent for mental health and addiction, the number went up to 68% of the people polled. So we simply ask you, please allow us to put on the ballot to allow the voters of the county to tell us what they're willing to do. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cooner. Our next speaker is Danielle Angelari, also speaking on mental health, sales tax, discussion related to, again, mental health, and she joins us from NAMI.
Are you guys ready for another one? So my name is Danielle, and I come to you as a representative of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Northern Illinois chapter, a fellow community member, voter, taxpayer, and as many of you can relate, someone who knows and loves someone living with a mental health condition or substance abuse disorder. I come to tell you, as a community, we're missing the mark. I'm here because I speak with individuals and families in need every day, lost, confused, feeling alone, and I hear the barriers firsthand, and I wanted to bring them to your attention. 1 in 5 individuals live with a diagnosed mental health condition every year. This includes, at the very least, 20% of our homeless population, almost 40% of incarcerated adults, and 70% of the youth in our juvenile justice system. And keep in mind, 90% of people who have died by suicide have experienced symptoms of a mental health condition. These national averages reflect right here in our home. Why are these numbers so high? Less than half of individuals who need mental health services do not receive them because of the barriers such as wait lists, unaffordability, a falling number in service providers, stigma, transportation, language, limited crisis intervention services, and proper community education, just to name a few. Aside from generous private donors, there are 0 local dollars funding these things. The system of care is in an emergency state, and the demand for care far exceeds Winnebago County's current capacities. I come to ask you to be a part of the solution and to vote yes on putting the mental health tax referendum on the 2020 ballot, because the community will pay either way. So put the power in the community's hands. Our mental health depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Our next speaker, Jeanette Towns, also speaking on the mental health referendum question.
Good evening. My name is Jeanette. I'm a mother of 2 wonderful daughters and a grandmother of 6. Family is very important to me. I am in daily contact with my parents as well as my children. I feel the need to share my personal experiences of living with a diagnosed mental illness. For many years, I hid my condition as best I could. Then I was encouraged to share with others. My childhood was marred by depression, but I didn't have a name for it back then. These bouts intensified as the years went on. Thoughts of hopelessness and worthlessness filled my mind. In 1995, I suffered my first manic episode. After a hospital stay, I found out that I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. There was no discharge plan, and I was left to fend for myself. To me, this is a cruel, heinous, and insidious disease. I've survived its torments. I was in denial for many years after receiving my diagnosis. I continued to go unmedicated and receiving no mental health care. The bouts of mania intensified. I exhibited risky behavior, such as hypersexuality. The stress from what I was experiencing caused my youngest daughter to break out in a rash from head to toe, because mental health takes a toll on the whole family. After extreme manic episodes, I would sink deeper and deeper into depression. Around 5 years later, a case with the local mental health center was opened up, and I began receiving services for the very first time. When I thought nobody was looking, I stopped taking my meds, started getting in trouble with the law, and was in and out of various hospitals. I was even homeless by choice a few times. After landing in jail one last time, I was sent to Elgin Mental Health Center, the forensics unit, where I had a 4-month stay. I was given meds, and I was finally stabilized. There is no reason 8 years should have passed and lapsed without me receiving proper care. And no one should have to get in trouble with the law just to receive services. My story shows that stronger mental health services are desperately needed in Winnebago County. Individuals have to leave our area to receive the type of care that they need. Voting yes to putting the mental health tax referendum on the 2020 ballot would mean adding much needed crisis, adolescent, and long-term care for the citizens of our county. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Our final speaker this evening, also speaking on the mental health sales tax referendum question, is Marianne Abadi.
Good evening. Last but hopefully not least, my name is Marianne Abadi, and I have worked in mental health in Rockford, Winnebago County for 41 years. I was the director of Janet Waddles Center under Frank Ware, and when Janet Waddles merged with Rosecrans, I became the vice president of public policy under Phil Eaton. During the 41 years that I worked in mental health, I was on call every night for 25 of those years. My husband's here tonight, and he can attest to that fact. I consulted with any staff that went into our local emergency rooms that were dealing with psychiatric crises. So I feel I'm a very good judge of our system of care and what is lacking. The status of mental health is at a crisis level in Winnebago County, as there's a major lack of access to mental health and substance abuse services for kids and adults due to not having enough providers for low-income residents. Suicide was the 11th leading cause of death in Illinois in 2017, but it's on the rise regardless of gender and race. Local organizations have worked very hard to help those with mental illnesses to lower the suicide rates in our area, but there's inadequate capacity. We're seeing an increase in suicide in 2018 in the US. It went from 13 to 15%, but in Illinois, it's at 23%. 1 out of 5 Americans suffer from some type of mental illness. And there is a direct correlation between suicide, mental illness, and substance abuse. A lot of people seek drugs, alcohol, and in this day and age, it's really been the opioid crisis as a solution to their original problem. So when those drugs or alcohol are not available, that original problem magnifies. And the solution, the next solution for many is suicide due to the emotional pain. At this point in time, I'm not aware of any local funding for mental health services in Winnebago County. Most counties in Illinois fund additional mental health and substance abuse services through property taxes. Without sufficient access to mental health and substance abuse services, our community will continue to destabilize, causing decreased quality of life for our residents, decreased lifespan, as a person with serious mental illness lives 25 less years than the average person. We will continue to depend on our first responders to provide the crisis intervention for people in psychiatric crisis. We'll continue to use Winnebago County Jail and or emergency rooms as the primary resource. This only encourages a revolving door syndrome, and that benefits no one. I ask you to consider to allow the residents of Winnebago County.
Marianne, we're at the 3-minute mark, and I'm sorry to cut you
That's
off
all
right
right.
before the end. I apologize for that.
That's it. I had one other sentence, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I didn't. Thank God I didn't fall.
Moved like a cat.
Thank you very much to our speakers. Our next item of business, item 7, board member correspondence. Any comments or questions by board members? Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to be selfish for just a minute, really quick. Normally we don't do personal things here. I've asked my son to show up tonight. He's leaving to go become a Marine January 6th. Just as a family, we're really proud of him. 4th generation decision to go to the military. And I would encourage any of us that have young family members looking for a better path or a good future, check out your local service branch. So congratulations.
Why don't you stand up, sir?
Thank you, Chairman.
I think Mr. Hoffman's a Marine. And Mr. Booker. We have 2 other Marines in the room. There you go. Good luck to you, and thank you for sharing that, Mr. McDonald. Any other comments by board members? Seeing none, we'll move on to the chairman's report. I'll move quickly through a couple of items. In your packet and online is the letters regarding the refugee resettlement related to the president's executive order. Basically, governors, mayors, chairmen were asked from around the country to weigh in on their thoughts regarding refugee resettlement. Not weighing in was basically saying, it's in reverse almost, that you would not want your community to accept refugees going forward. So you had to write and basically affirm you wanted to continue that practice. In your packets is the letter that was sent on behalf of myself, as well as the one from the governor. I believe Mayor McNamara sent a letter as well. The next item, just the appointment process for the newly established Mental Health Board, just to separate out two issues for the room, for the media, for the board. Last month, the board voted, I believe, near unanimously to establish the Mental Health Board. The item tonight before the board is the question about the ballot question for the March primary related to the sales tax increase for mental health funding. At this point, as it's passed by the board, we have to fill the board. The appointment recommendation would come from myself. The board would approve each appointment. At this point, as passed by this board and as it stands, there's a county board member that would be recommended to sit and be a voting member of the Mental Health Board. I believe that regardless of the outcome tonight, and especially if we put it on the ballot, but I think regardless of outcome, it's important that we seat this board quickly. I'm looking for input. Dr. Martell, I believe, has put up on the website, and we'll make sure it's readily available to the media, that there's a call for applicants related to serving on the board. There is some criteria. So be aware of that, and if you have any input from the community and or as board members, please reach out directly. And I would like to see some movement on that in January. The next item is the host fee update. Myself, Mr. Dornbush, and Mr. Billick are going to sit down. There is a number of multi-year host fee commitments that we are locked into by contract, but there's also several annual commitments that the county has made on a regular basis. They're not bound by contract, but they're commitments like the U of I extension, Alignment Rockford, and several others that will be coming up for discussion in early January. Going to sit down with our Economic Development Chairman and Chris from Planning, and we'll be having more discussion in early 2020 on that particular piece of host fee. In terms of the landfill, a few of us received an email, a resident, Mr. Kelly, who's the district rep there at the landfill, and myself received an email from somebody in the AG's office, the Attorney General's office, encouraging folks, basically laying out that they will be back in court with the landfill and the IPA in January. Number two is that they did encourage folks to continue when there's an odor concern to report that through the proper channels, and there was a request for that continued communication from the community when there are issues. Tonight before the board is the resolution where the board would officially weigh in, calling for the landfill to comply with these basic IEPA standards. Last month, I believe it was a month ago, I asked as chairman directly to the landfill for their commitment to that basic promise that all landfills around the state do need to comply with. There's another item under new business this evening. Oh, Mr. Kelly.
Yeah, new development just today. I've been talking to Lacey Ballard, the manager of the landfill, for months. This really kind of came to a head last spring when there was a huge meeting in New Milford. And after that meeting, I met with Lacey Ballard and his staff at the landfill, and they explained everything they're trying to do to mitigate the odor problem and the garbage problem. After that meeting, I started doing a little research on my own and read of a system where that sprays a vapor into the air to create a curtain that mitigates the odor by precipitating out the obnoxious chemicals that are creating the stench. Lacey contacted us today and explained that 4,000 feet of that system are being installed.
Very good.
So I'm hopeful it works.
And I appreciate you sharing that. As more updates come, we'll keep sharing them at board meetings, and I appreciate you sharing that newest piece of information related to the landfill. Thank you, Mr. Kelly. There's an item under new business this evening. It is the resolution, I believe, brought forward by a couple of board members related to the county executive question going on the ballot, not in the primary and not in the March primary, but in the November 2020 general election. We want to start that discussion early. I would make this point that the item before the board for actual action tonight, the mental health question, the board is not being asked to raise taxes this evening. They're being asked to put a question on the ballot to have a community discussion around mental health. I can't imagine how we're not better off as a community for having that discussion over the next few months leading up to the March election. Also, to that point, is I believe then in November, I cannot imagine how our community is worse off for having a discussion and letting the boss, the taxpayer, weigh in on the structure of county government for the future. And so I look forward to both of those discussions as we go forward, and appreciate your attention to the chairman's report this evening. Any questions? Seeing none, we will move on to announcements and communications. I'll turn that over to Clerk Gummow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The items listed below were received as correspondence.
And we will place those on file. Now, while you're all here tonight, I know is for the Raffle report approval. And may I please have a motion to approve the consent agenda, which includes the Raffle report, bills, approval of the November 14th minutes, and layover of the November 26th minutes. I got a motion by Mr. Hoffman, second by Mr. Billick, Mrs. Crosby. The consent agenda is now before the board for consideration. Any questions? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you very much. Motion passes unanimously. Next item of business, County Administrator's Report. Steve, do you have anything for us this evening?
Real quick, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Three quick items. First of all, the county offices will be closed on December 24th and 25th of next week, and January 1st of the following week. Second item, the county's involved in the Complete Count 2020 census project, along with a number of other communities in the area. That's being funded through a grant received through the state of Illinois to the Region 1 Planning Council. There will be a grant agreement and budget amendment to be presented to the board in January for that amount. The grant amount is, I believe, $39,700. Last item, Joe is not here tonight, but his final day of work will be on January 24th, 2020. There will be an open house at the Highway Department from 1 to 4 on that day. And we're also proceeding with the process to recommend a successor to Joe. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chapman. Speaking of the census, I was at a meeting today, the Region 1 Planning Council meeting. It was mentioned that the importance of the census is really along two lines. One, from a representation standpoint. Number two, related to the fact that it costs the importance of this is about $1,500 per person annually in terms of economic impact with potential federal funding. So it's a very important discussion, and early 2020 is where there'll be more discussion at the board level. Any department head updates? Seeing none. Dr. Martell, anything you'd like to add? Okay, thank you very much. Next item then would be standing committee reports, Finance Committee, and standing in for Mr. Salgado is Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You are on now.
I am on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Finance Committee has 6 items, and with no objection from the chair, I would like to move item 2 to the bottom of the list.
Okay.
All right, thank you. So our first item is Budget Amendment 2020-005, the Axion network enhancements, and that is to be laid over.
Okay.
Our next item is Budget Amendment 2020-006, and that is Tough Books replacement, and that is also to be laid over.
Okay.
Our next item is Budget Amendment 2020-007, electronic healthcare, to be laid over, and I'd like to make a motion to suspend the rules on that one.
We have a motion by Mr. Gurl to suspend the rules on this item. May I have a second, please? Mrs. Gurl on the second, Mr. Webster on the second. The motion, the second, is to suspend the rules, which would allow us to vote this evening. Any questions? All those in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? We've suspended the rules. Thank you very much. Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a motion to accept that. Budget Amendment 2020-007, electronic healthcare, and I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. Gurl on 2020-007 electronic healthcare. May I have a second, please? Mr. Hoffman, thank you. Mrs. Crosby, Mr. Webster. Any discussion by board members on this item? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We will note Mr. Schultz is a no vote, and we'll cast a yes vote for all other members present. Motion passes. Thank you very much. Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is Budget Amendment 2020-008, and that is an animal donation to be laid over. And I would like to move to suspend the rules on that, please.
We got a motion by Mr. Gurl on 2020-008, animal donation, to suspend the rules. A second by Mr. Fiducia and Mr. Westcott and Mr. Hoffman. Motion second to suspend. Any questions? Seeing none, all those in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. We've suspended the rules. Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I make a motion to entertain that budget amendment.
We've got a motion by Mr. Gurl on 2020-008, animal donation. Second again by Mr. Westcott, Mr. Hoffman. This item is now before the board for consideration. Any discussion or questions? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next resolution is a resolution authorizing the settlement of pending litigation, and that is awarded to Laverne Huggins in the amount of $62,500, and I so move.
Motion by Mr. Gurl on the settlement regarding pending litigation with Mrs. Huggins in the amount of $62,500. May I have a second, please? We have a motion. I do not see a I have a second by Mr. Neighbors, Mr. Fellers, Mr. McDonald. We have a motion and a second. Item is now before the board for consideration. Yes, Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, just so that I understand, this is an issue related to the Sheriff's Department, and they're independent of the board. So, I'm not completely clear why the board is involved in this. If the Sheriff's Department gets sued, why doesn't the Sheriff's Department pay the settlement for the lawsuit?
That's a topic that has come up before. I'm going to refer that to legal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask Mr. Carpenter, who was assigned to handle the case, to address your question, Mr. Arena.
Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you. By state law, the county indemnifies the Sheriff's Department and its employees. So it's by state law, and it's paid out of the tort fund, not so it doesn't get paid out of department budgets, or that's where the money would come from.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. Mrs. Gurl.
Thank you. How much of that $62,500 is going to the attorney? Her attorney fees? I think it's around $50,000, is it not?
If I can answer it, if I may.
Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you. It's a negotiated settlement. It's up to her and her attorneys how that gets split up. We don't have we're not privy to that information.
Thank you.
Nor, I believe, can we dictate that, and it's not part of the current settlement. Okay, thank you, Mrs. Gurl. Any other questions by board members on the pending litigation with Mrs. Huggins? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving this settlement signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? No. I'll ask for a hand raise if anybody that voted no. I heard one or two. Mr. Booker is a no vote. Mrs. Crosby is a no vote. We will cast a yes vote for all other members present. So motion passes. Thank you very much. Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to our last and final item, which one is everyone here is for, and this is a resolution submitting to the electors by referendum the question of imposing a 0.5% special county retailer's occupation tax, otherwise known as sales tax, for mental health purposes for a period not to exceed 6 years for the county of Winnebago, and I so move.
We have a motion by Mr. Gurl on the question on the ballot regarding mental health sales tax, a second by Mr. Neighbors, second by Mr. Hoffman and Mr. Westcott. The item is motioned and seconded and now before the board for discussion and questions. Any comments by board members? Yes, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to speak to this item here. It was, my first knowledge of this was this past Monday, and it was by way of a forwarded email by yourself, which I found a little bit disheartening based on the magnitude of what's going on here and what's at stake. I just wish that there would have been a little more effort to have some discussion. And I had a magnitude of questions regarding what the business plan would be, the wording of the question, which I just seen the actual wording of the question on the ballot this evening. Up until half hour ago, I didn't even know what it would say. But like I say, I will not be supporting this, but it is not against mental health, doing things for the mental health in our community, but more for against those that put this together haphazardly and didn't let me be aware of it more than 3 days ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. I see that Mr. Salgado, our Finance Committee Chairman, is not here this evening. I believe that came out of his committee 6-0. I cannot speak for, defend, or not otherwise the communication between that committee and yourself. I don't know. But thank you for your comment. Any other comments or questions by board members? Yes, Mr. Arena, then Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to say, first of all, my profession is providing housing. I've done that here in this community for 29 years, and I've had countless experiences with people suffering from mental illnesses and in a mental crisis and not having any resource or way to deal with it. I've experienced overdoses, suicide. I can't agree more with the need. I think it's a desperate need, so I'm not disputing that at all. But the fact is, this happens in conjunction with everything else that's happening with the business of the county. We passed this year a budget with a $600,000 deficit. We have the sheriff requesting more money. And that's an issue that many of the people on this board have been working on. Just like Mr. Tassoni, I only recently became aware of this, and I believe that the sales tax is really our only option for fixing our budget crisis. We don't have it. Myself reaching out to my constituents, I got a strong objections to any type of increase in property taxes. So this was, in my mind, our option to correct our budget problem. And this resolution will step in front of those efforts. I don't think we can go to the citizens in March and raise the sales tax and then come back again and try to raise it to fix our problem. So unfortunately, this leaves us in a bad situation. And having this short amount of time to address it puts us in a difficult spot, because on one hand, I want to see the people who need this service get it, but on the other hand, we have other groups that come to us, and there's a lot of compelling stories that we hear with the need for funds, and we're out of money. I think all of us on this board realize that. I disagree that waiting until November would kill this. In November, actually, there'll be more people that vote than in the primary election, and if you truly want to get a sense for what the majority of the citizens of Winnebago County want, in an election where there's more people voting would give you a more accurate representation. And it also would give us the opportunity to do a comprehensive analysis of our budget and our situation and try to figure out exactly how do we fix this. Because the year before I became on this board, we passed a deficit budget. This year we passed a deficit budget. You can only do that so many times, and there's no extra money. We're going to run out of money. That's inevitable. So for that reason, I think we need to wait until November to do this. And I do support the need, but I also feel we need space to address our other budget problems. And so I move that we send this matter back to committee.
So the motion on the floor is to send this back to committee. I see a hand up. That would be a second. by Mr. Tassoni to send it back to committee. So we have a motion and a second to send this item before the board back to committee. Any discussion on the motion, a second to send it back to committee? I see hands up. I do have, I believe, Mr. Neighbors. Then we have other hands up as well. Mr. Neighbors.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't agree with sending this back to committee, and I do support this vote just for the simple fact if we send this back to committee, we're missing the deadline in December to get this onto the ballot in March. So in order to send it back to committee, we'll have to wait till November. And I disagree with Mr. Arena saying that it'll fail in November. Just for the if we send it to November, we'll be competing against the governor's fair tax clause in November. So if we wait till November, we'll be competing against fair tax. And mental health is not funded in Winnebago County at all. So we have funding for the Sheriff's Department, we have funding for the county, but zero funding for mental health. Now we have funding to where we could work with our budget and work with our means. If we have the public safety sales tax, and we have the tax that that the sheriff receives to receive his budget. So he's working with multiple streams on public safety, but mental health has none. And, if you look at Winnebago County and any other municipality, if you look at it as a business, we produce products, and some of our products are our people. If we want to bring people into this county in order to work, we have to produce a better product. And just like Ms. Jeanette came up here to speak, when she was suffering mental illness without any treatment, she was not a workable employee. But after she got her treatment, she's able to be an employee that someone wants to come into wants to have at their business. So if we don't work on the mental illness in our community right now and take this opportunity to help these mental illness, we'll forever be telling our businesses we don't want to provide you with stable employees.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Neighbors. I believe the next person I had was Mr. Booker, then Mrs. Gorel, and then I do have others as well. The item that is before the board, because we've amended our motion, the motion is, the amendment is to send it back to committee. That's what's before the board at this time. Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chairman. I had some of my questions answered, so I'll yield to the next question.
Thank you, Mr. Booker. Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, County Board has been aware of, maybe you have not been paying attention, for the last 8 years, because we had a mental health committee through the health department. At that time, we were looking and searching for financing so that we would not go into the taxpayers' property to tax. We have waited for an opportunity for a long time to get this on a ballot so we could use a 0.5% sales tax. And remember, that sales tax doesn't affect food, so you can eat all the food you want, and that's not going to affect it. This has been going on for too long. This last 10 years of us searching, and we had a committee even searching for funding, this is the first window of opportunity that this committee has had to get this on a ballot and get it done and get through with it. Even when you get it on the ballot, if it gets approved, it takes a couple of years just to get it started. It's not something that happens overnight. Also, remember, this does not come out of your general fund. This is a sales tax. It will be under a complete different, it's going to be completely separated from our 1% sales tax for the jail. As far as our budget is concerned, you have had many opportunities over the years to fix that deficit, and you haven't. So why all of a sudden are we going to go for a 0.5% sales tax? You should have done that 3 years ago, 4 years ago, to balance our budget. Not wait till we have something so serious as our mental health and then put up You know, and then we're arguing over which one should go on the ballot first, mental health or the deficit of our budget. Well, we got pushed aside years ago for mental health because the state of Illinois figured that mental health wasn't important, and they took it off of, to balance their budget, they took it off of. So I want you to consider this, board members, as you're thinking about it. I know many of you want to send it back. No, it can't be tabled. It's got to go through now. It's very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. A question before I go to our next question for Steve. 0.5% sales tax equates to about how much money in annualized revenue, if you look at history as a trend?
Probably 13 to 14 mil.
Okay. Thank you very much, Steve. All right, we have a person, Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start here. I don't like sales taxes. I don't like sales taxes as a way of funding government. Sales taxes are naturally regressive. They have an outsized effect on the poor in our community. Poor people in general pay about 17% of their income to sales tax versus less than 1% for the wealthy. Every time we add a sales tax, we tax the poor. Every time we spend money online and that sales tax doesn't come back to this county, it shifts more of that burden onto the poor in this county. That said, I cannot think of another way to fund this right now. And this is something that this community needs immediately. When we hear about using the sales tax to, and I'm on Jermaine here, I am not supporting a layover. When we talk about funding our budget deficit with a sales tax, what we're actually talking about is sinking more of that is asking for more sales taxes to sink into public safety, because that's the biggest piece of our budget. I'm not voting for another dollar to go into that black hole until they tell us how it's spent. Is that what we want to do? Get another $14 million when they won't even do a lean process study, an efficiency study? No. The original sales tax was supposed to fund initiatives like this. And the jail and the sheriff's department slowly took the money from those, and we poured money away. This is our chance right now to fund something that will pay for itself in the long term. Fewer people in our criminal court system, fewer people in our jail, fewer people on the street, fewer people needing social services because they are getting the treatment they need. If this was an epidemic in which we were all coughing up blood every day, believe me, we'd spend $14 million on that right now. But mental health is a hidden pandemic. And anyone here who knows someone who has suffered from depression, bipolar disorder, BPD, you name them, know that treatment and regular treatment and constant treatment, whether it's medication or therapy or talk therapy, is required consistently and constantly. So if we vote to lay this over, I'm calling you all cowards. Put this on the ballot. Let the people decide for themselves if this is how they want to spend the money, but put it on the ballot now.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Any other questions or comments by board members? I have Mrs. Crosby, then Mr. Butita. Mrs. Crosby.
I'm going to speak against sending this back to committee. I agree with Mr. Neighbors and Mr. Fellers and Ms. Gorel. Mental health has to be addressed, but more importantly than that, let our community decide where they want that money spent, and not the folks in this room. I believe that our constituents are bright enough, are intellectual enough to make that call on March 17th, 2020. I trust their judgment. I'm not going to second guess them. If they want this, they should have it. Hey guys, can you just stop for a minute?
Mrs. Crosby has the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. This is very distracting. Secondly, when we approved the Winnebago County Community Mental Health Board, nobody linked together the 13 to 14 million that was going to follow it at this meeting. And so I agree with Mr. Tassoni that he is absolutely correct that we should have been informed about this way before, and I think the heartburn comes that I'm not sure that the structure of how this is going to be implemented is the best practice. So I'm going to support sending this to the referendum, but I'm also going to oppose the current structure that we have, and I want it revisited, and I want to have our community partners included in the discussion so that at the end of the day, we have a real sound working model that we can use. So that's my position this evening.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. I believe Mr. Batita is next. Mr. Batita.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm like Mr. Tassoni, just found, I heard about this this past weekend. And I appreciate the speakers we had tonight. They gave us some information and some impassioned pleas, and I'm sympathetic to that. I'm also sympathetic to being in favor of voter initiative. I think that's an important thing. But I also think there's, we have to do due process. And I don't feel I know enough right now to say that I want to vote yes. I want to put this back to committee. I think putting it on a November ballot where there are more voters who can be educated and probably have a maybe even a greater success is, in my opinion, the best way to proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Batita. Did I see another hand up? Mr. Tassoni, I'll go back to you a second time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just for clarification, my displeasure about the process and how it got to me on 3 days ago was not towards the Finance Committee. It was to all those many more months and years before that.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni. Any other questions or comments by board members? Mr. Girl, anything you'd want to add as the sit-in chair tonight?
Thank you, Chairman. Most of what I wanted to say has been said. I don't think a board of 20 should dictate what a community of 300,000 want or demand. It has always been my stance that the voters should tell their electors what to do, not the other way around. I am unpleased with the process of how many months this was in the making and that it just got to us a little over a week ago. I thought there could have been more communication with this board and that mental health group, advisory group that was forming this question. This is a large ask of our community. 14 million is a large ask. I do believe it is up to the voters. I wish it would have came to us differently, but it is up to us to put it out to the voters to say yes or no. And with that, I will yield back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Girl. Any other comments, questions? Yes, I'll go back to you a second time, Mr. Neighbors.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you're saying $14 million is a large ask of the community. When the Singer Mental Health Institute closed down, their operating budget was $12 million. So we lost $12 million in our community when Singer closed down. So that's not really a large, I mean, it's a large ask, but we have to do it because the state is not coming to our rescue. And, you know, I'll share a story. And, you know, a few months ago, I had a first cousin that suffered mental illness. He was receiving services at the Singer Mental Institute. He chose to kidnap some kids and barricade himself in a house. And end result, he was shot by the police and killed. But had he been receiving his mental services that he should have been getting from the state that was not given to him anymore, he might not have chose to go down that route. Because when we have many more stories in Winnebago County like that, and if we wait and try to hold off and put it forward, I mean, push it to November, it's just like kicking the can down the road. Eventually the can is gonna get kicked to the side and you're not gonna walk that path anymore. So we have to put it on now while on the March ballot, you know, so, you know, we're online on Tiger right now and not competing against another tax. So that's my 2 cents. I think we should not lay it over. I think we should vote on it to put the referendum on the ballot in March and let the voters have their say.
Thank you very much, Mr. Neighbors. I'll go back, Mrs. Gorel, a second time.
Thank you. The one thing I don't think many of you understand, that window of opportunity just came available. The state would never let us do a tax for mental health, a sales tax. It wasn't until our state representatives finally got on it. Dr. Martell and I went to them 2 years ago asking them to try and work something out for sales tax. And they just said, yeah, they'd consider it. Well, they got it passed this year, this spring. And I just really wasn't even aware of it because it wasn't talked about until probably midsummer. This has been a very short period of getting all this together and bringing it forward. But it's like I say, this has been the first window of opportunity we have had. The state has turned their back on us a long time ago. There's still a couple of things in that statute that we need to talk about to our state reps to see if they can't do a little bit of amending to the way it's done. But when you all of a sudden get this dumped on you, and boy, was it a happy day when this happened and our state reps worked for us to do this. It's been a wonderful thing, and I'm sure that the Rockford Area Regional Council would be more than happy to come and sit with all of us at one of our meetings so that they can explain to you exactly how the budget is done. It's very important to all of us to see that, which I understand as part of the problem right now is you haven't seen how their budget is. But I'm sure within the next month or so, they're going to be able to come to us. We'll invite them to come and explain all this to us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Did I see your hand up, Mr. Webster? No? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Any other questions or comments by board members? Was there any other items or any other themes or discussions in the Finance Committee related to this topic we haven't hit on? I don't want to be redundant, but was there anything missing from that committee discussion that we haven't shared this evening?
Thank you, Chairman. I think we pretty much hit on everything. There was discussions about how the state should do more and how we agree with that, but yet we've seen what the state can do for us, and it's not much. There was discussion about taking things in our own hand. Mr. Neighbors pointed on that, and I think that's really what this does, is kind of put the ball into our court and lets us decide, Winnebago County as a whole, on how we deal with problems, especially mental health. And other than that, that was basically all that was discussed at our Finance Committee last week.
And just for the record, what was the vote out of committee?
The vote was unanimous, 6-0.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussions or comments by board members? Seeing none, the item before the board is to send this back to committee. A yes vote would send it back to committee, which since it came from finance, it would return to finance. That was the motion in the second. A no vote keeps it here. And then in a separate vote, we would vote. If it stays here, we got to vote separately to pass it tonight. This is whether or not we send it to committee or yes, or not. I will ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote does send it to committee. A no vote keeps it here. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors?
No.
Mrs. Rudd? No. Mr. Schultz has left the building. Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Mr. Westcott?
No.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer? Mr. Butita?
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby?
No.
Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
No.
I'm sorry?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Girl?
No.
Mrs. Gorel?
No.
Mr. Hoffman?
No.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Motion fails, and so it will stay here for further discussion and then a vote this evening. So the motion to send it back to committee has failed narrowly. I'll get the official vote count from Clerk Gumow, so we're accurate for the record. Clerk Gumow?
8 yes, 10 no, 2 absent.
Okay. So the item will stay here. The motion then before the board for consideration is the, as was originally brought in, the sales tax referendum ballot question in the March primary ballot, to ask the voters what they would want to do with that. Any other further discussion on the item before the board? Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand, everyone's motivation in wanting to keep it here. I agree, it's a very important issue. I am going to vote yes to put it on the ballot, since we are faced with that choice now. But I also want to say to all of my colleagues here on the board that we have to stop spending money we don't have. And if this passes, we have to live within the means that we have. There's not going to be any new revenue from my perspective.
Mr. Arena has the floor, guys.
And I just
Hold on, Mr.
want to
Arena
make
has the
sure that moving forward and as we take this vote, that we're fully aware of that fact. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. Any other comments by board members? Seeing none, the item before the board is to place this on the ballot or not. A yes vote, now it's in reverse, a yes vote would place it on the ballot, a no vote would keep it off of the ballot. Since there's no other hands up, no other questions by board members, I will ask the clerk to call the roll, and again, a yes vote places it on the ballot, a no vote does not. Clerk, I'm out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Neighbors? Yes. Mrs. Red? Yes. Mr. Tassoni? No. Mr. Webster? Yes. Mr. Westcott? Yes. Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer? No. Mr. Butita?
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby?
Yes.
Mr. Fellers?
Yep.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Did he say pass? Yes. I'm sorry, Mr. Billich, can you confirm your? Yes. It was a yes.
Motion passes. It will be on the ballot in March, and we'll get the official vote tally from Clerk Gumow.
2 and 2. Mr. Chairman, that was 16 yes, 2 no, and 2 absent.
Okay, thank you very much. Item passes. I will go back to Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes our report, and I want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy Holidays and a Happy New Year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next item of business, Economic Development Committee. We will ask our friends, our guests, to, as they exit as quietly as possible. We'll get on to our next item of business. Next item of business is the Economic Development Committee. Mr. Billick. I hope not everybody's taking the elevator. Jamming in there. Let's give them 1 minute here. It's just going to be hard. Sorry, I didn't mean to set you up.
No, you're fine.
Kids getting service hours. Students, I should say. We have some students getting quick signatures.
Anybody else need a signature?
Good luck to you, sir. Okay, we're going to get going in 1 minute, so we'll get these signatures and we'll move on to our next item of business. Yes, and we want to thank our students for coming tonight. Thank you for being here. What's that? Take a picture, yes.
Thank you for staying.
Come on up. You got a phone? Be good. Okay, we're going to move on with our next item of business, and I'll turn things over momentarily to Mr. Billick. We have a number of items still remaining on our agenda. Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tonight we have 3 matters of business. Our first matter of business is actually carried over. It was laid over from last meeting. It is the resolution authorizing the execution of an intergovernmental agreement with the Northern Illinois Land Bank Authority regarding initiating petitions to have properties declared abandoned, and I move.
We got a motion by Mr. Billick on the abandonment property IGA with R1. I have a second by Mrs. Crosby. We have a motion and a second. The item that laid over from the last committee is now before the board. Any discussion or questions? Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We had a lot of conversation about this last meeting, and there's been conversations between myself and some other board members since then. I know I had expressed objection to this. I feel my concerns would be resolved if the board member whose district the property is in also signs off on it when they're going to take action to declare it abandoned and take it. So I move that we amend paragraph 8 in the contacts to include the county board member whose district the subject property is in.
So we have a motion by Mr. Arena to amend the IGA to include that when there's an abandoned, just so I get the sentiment right, when there's an abandoned property in question that would be going through the judicial deed process, that it would require the sign-off of the particular county board member and the chairman. Is that correct?
Well, it was amended prior to the last meeting to be the chairman, the state's attorney.
No.
And that's,
The state's attorney does not sign off on that.
I'm looking at it now.
State's attorney does not sign off on it.
Well, according to my reading of this document, it does. So we should clarify that.
Yep. My understanding is that the state's attorney would provide legal counsel. The state's attorney's office should not be in the business of policymaking, but merely advising on a legal basis. If I'm misunderstanding that, and we are now putting the state's attorney in the role of policymaker, I just want to be clear on the floor as well.
My understanding of the document that I'm looking at, it says, let me just read the relevant section.
Which
It
paragraph?
refers to, paragraph 2 states, the last sentence says, it identifies the parcel in Exhibit B, which is identified here, and then it says, Exhibit B may be amended from time to time by written agreement of the parties' contacts as defined herein. And the parties' contacts in paragraph 8 says for the county, the board chairman of Winnebago County, and below that it says state's attorney of Winnebago County. So my interpretation is when they, in the future, replace the property that's this IGA is dealing with a new property, the chairman would have to sign off on it and the state's attorney would have to sign off on it. That's how I'm interpreting this.
I believe you're interpreting that incorrectly.
If I could, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Marilyn?
Yeah, the state's attorney is serving as legal advisor, and we are going to make sure that the legal process is followed, but the state's attorney is not signing off technically on any policy to take the property. State's attorney role is just to make sure that the statutes that are included in this resolution are properly followed.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for that clarification. So then, I guess, back to your comment, Mr. Chairman, it would be the county board chairman and the board member whose district the property is in.
Okay, so there's a motion by thank you, Mr. Arena. Mr. Arena's made a motion to say that for item to go through the judicial deed process, it would have to be signed off on by the chairman and the respective county board member. So for example, if it's in Mr. Feller's district, he would have to sign off. That's the motion in the second. I just want to make sure I'm understanding the role in the process. If the land bank would want to go through this process, my understanding is they don't need anybody's permission to research properties. Only after the judicial deed process has come to completion would the chairman sign off. At what point in the process is there sign off? Just so we're clear I want to be clear, I don't want there to be a false impression that after a judge speaks that a board member and a chairman sign off, if that's not the case, or that if the chairman and the board member would sign off early in the process. Where in the process are we saying that the chairman and a prospective board member would sign off? Just so I'm clear on the floor.
My understanding is it's at the beginning of the process, right? When you identify a new property, that's when you sign off. That's my understanding.
My understanding is that at the end of the process, that is when the chairman would sign off as it stands right now, meaning that after a judge takes action, there would be final sign off. If I'm mistaken, I am in no way trying to be argumentative, but I think that's a fair question since there's been questions on this. Typically, it is only after action and work has been done. We're not pre-approving work when even the folks at the land bank may not know if they're going to complete the process. I don't know that it's the place of the county to get in the way of a judge before they go through the process.
I have to disagree with you. This says the county authorizes and engages Northern Illinois Land Bank Authority and its council to file and prosecute on its behalf petitions for a declaration of abandonment. So, and then it says all parcels identified in Exhibit B. So we're giving them the authority to take action based on Exhibit B, and then Exhibit B can be changed by written agreement of the county's contacts, by you. So when they start with a new property, they identify it and they decide they want to go to court and file. Before they file, my understanding is you have to give them written agreement to do so. That's what I'm reading.
That was not my understanding, but let's get clear. I'll either go to the state's attorney, or I do see Michael Dunn Jr. from our one who's been instrumental in this, if somebody would like to take that question. Mr. Dunn?
There's a handheld microphone. Or
Boomer's got it. He's got him. He's got him.
Mike,
Or either way.
or there.
Good evening. Again, glad to be here. So there's multiple dynamics occurring right now, and I want to use this opportunity to make sure everybody has clarity. There was a multi-party IGA that we all discussed last spring that the county was a part of that binds every government entity to be a member of the Land Bank Board and gives you an appointment on the Land Bank Board. That IGA has been passed, it's not being edited, and that allows your appointee to sit on the Land Bank Board and make decisions on property acquisitions and disposals, whether they happen in Freeport or Belvedere. You have an equal say, and how the state money is used to fund land bank activities. The IGA in front of you now is a courtesy to you. We don't require it. We don't need you to even pass it. I'm okay if you don't pass it. It is a way that if we use one way, we have 5 or 6 ways to acquire property. All standard ways that you can do yourself. We can take a donation, we can take a deed and move foreclosure, we can acquire properties, we can simply go and make a private party transaction at $20,000 and buy a property from a willing seller. We have many ways to acquire property. One of the ways that the state of Illinois wants us to acquire property is using a unique state statute, an abandonment process, and seeking a judicial deed, in this case from the 17th Circuit, in meeting standards
that are spelled out in state statute that we would acquire a property by petitioning the court. We have a lawyer that we're paying for, and that lawyer is going to appear maybe once, maybe twice a year. And that lawyer is going to go in to the 17th Circuit, and they're going to have a stack of property files that the Land Bank Board agreed to. Some might be from South Beloit, some might be from Belvedere, and they're going to go through that stack in one appearance to save all of us money and legal fees and represent every government entity. So any government entity that passed the IGA that is in front of you is given us permission to pay for our legal. It doesn't come out of your pocket or tax the state's attorney's office, but allows our legal representative to represent you in a very narrow band of seeking judicial deeds as a method of acquisition for the land bank. Again, the other IGA governs how we acquire property under every method. As far as the discussion I heard earlier tonight between County Board Member Arena and Chairman Haney, we have a process that when we acquire any property, as I promised to you last spring, after the Land Bank Board has voted, but prior to closing on the property, we ask the chief elected policymaker of that entity if they agree and if their staff agrees with the decision to acquire. And they have a right to say no. We do not agree with the Land Bank's decision. Gary Anderson, as your appointee, might be outvoted, and the Land Bank Board might be acting in unincorporated Winnebago, and the county has a right to say no. And so that's set up. In the IGA tonight, do you want our lawyer representing the state's attorney's office when he goes in or she goes in on a stack of properties where they're petitioning the court for judicial deed? If you want to put additional provisions in your IGA saying that certain other check box have to be checked for us to go after a specific property, that's up to you. As a land bank, we are going to have a uniform process in how we notify each of our member partners. We're not going to change our process for one government over another. We're going to keep it uniform. If once our request gets to the county administrator, what you all do internally is your business, it is not mine. And again, we will still acquire property for you without this IGA. We just won't acquire it through a judicial deed. And if you do not want us to acquire it through judicial deed, then we should stop this IGA now. So with all that rambling, I guess I would tell you that it's your decision. You're our client. We're willing to do it any way you'd like.
Thank you. Yes, Marilyn?
I'm sorry?
Marilyn?
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm looking at this, and it's my first time actually seeing this document, but I'm noting in paragraph 2, and did your office draft this?
No, our counsel did.
Your counsel did. So I just want the board to know paragraph 2 has an unconstitutional provision in it because the county cannot authorize or engage outside legal counsel without going to the court and indicating that there's a conflict with the state's attorney's office. The state's attorney's office, by Illinois Constitution and state statute, is the attorney for the county. So this provision is unconstitutional and not enforceable. So I just want to advise the county board of that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. So just to back up, we have a motion and a second by Mr. Arena on the amendment to the process. The comment made by the state's attorney raises a question we'll come back to, but I do see a hand up, Mr. Webster.
Yes, after hearing the remarks from our state's attorney's office, my recommendation would be to send this back to committee and get this ironed out. I cannot see how we could move forward after hearing from our state's attorney using the word unconstitutional. And so I see it would be foolish for us to move forward with this right at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. My understanding at the last board meeting, I clearly understood that the workaround with that item was that the state's attorney's office would appoint the land bank lawyer as a special assistant state's attorney on a limited scope basis. This was discussed on this very floor and I believe in committee. So that was the way in which we basically get free legal help, as did every other public entity. So that was very clearly and upfront addressed. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to echo on that, yeah, we had that discussion on this board floor where that the lawyer operating for the land bank is appointed as a special state's attorney, therefore fulfilling the constitutional statute that was just brought up. And it's that, in that sense, is the only way that they can act on our behalf at this one time where they come in. We had this conversation, I want to say a month ago, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, but I think it was about a month ago, on the very issue, and that was how we get around this. So,
Marilyn.
And we have had that discussion on the prior agreement, and the wording was changed. So my issue is the wording in paragraph 2.
Mr. Dunn.
So I would retract my answer to the state's attorney. We have not edited this document in several weeks. So whatever change occurred did not come from our office.
I'm not aware of a change. I do know this was, what was the date? I believe the date in which this went to the state's attorney's office. It's December 19th now. I believe this went to the state's attorney's office October 13th, if not October 9th. It's right in there, mid-October, and there were several discussions. And I want to be very upfront with Marilyn, not all directly with Marilyn, but with lawyers in the state's attorney's office who do work on that. And this issue was, I believe, resolved on the board floor. So yes. Any other questions or comments? Yes. Or did you have a follow-up? Then Mr. Tassoni. Mr. Fellers.
thank you. I just want to make sure that then, are we all looking at the most recent document, or did the wrong one make it into the packet? And because I remember resolving this, so.
The last action was we resolved this on the board floor where there would be legal help at the appointment of the SA's office. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like I say, I would echo what Mr. Webster had to say there too with, I'm very confused, and if Mr. Areno would retract his amendment, I would ask for this to be sent committee and let our state's attorney overview it, I guess, for, again, and come back with it as clean as it needs to be so that it can be approved. Thank you.
So I'll go back to Mr. Arena, if that's okay. Mr. Webster, you did have your hands up first. Would you prefer I go to Mr. Arena first or yourself? I don't want to cheat you.
I'd like 2 comments about this. Number one, this whole conversation when it started out there, I saw no harm, no foul in adding the words that Mr. Arena suggested in the first place about having a board member check off on that. No harm, no foul, okay? But number 2 now, when I heard from my state's attorney that she's using the word unconstitutional about something, she has a little problem with it, I will stand with my state's attorney's opinion on that. And therefore, that's why I think we should send this back to committee to get it ironed out. I don't see a problem with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am willing to retract my motion and have it sent back to committee.
Okay, Mr. Webster.
I'll second that.
We got a motion by Mr. Arena to send this. He retracted his motion, and we'll allow that to happen if that's the will of this group. And then we will have a motion by Mr. Arena to send this back. The committee that it came from was the Economic Development Committee. It came out of there 3 weeks ago.
Yes, split vote, unfavorably, but it was a split vote, 3-3.
Okay, so the motion is to send it back to the Economic Development Committee, where there will be more discussion about the legal language in a second by Mr. Webster. That motion to send to committee is now before the board.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Billett.
And as a point of a clarification, there was a couple people that said, well, did we not already change this as far as some language pieces? It was changed. There was a motion and approval for changes within our committee. This was prior to it coming to the board floor. We made a couple changes, and that was with, obviously, depending on between staff and state's attorney's office and everything like that. Maybe there was a typo or something else that needs to be fixed or corrected, but I do want to make sure that that is clarified out there. That last motion that Paul was making was in regards to
Mr. Arena was making was in regards to actually just adding in a county board member for that other measure as far as who gets notified. I just want to make sure that that was a clarification.
So the motion and the second is to send this back to committee. Any other comments, Mr. Fellers?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bilich, did we have that conversation in committee about the special state's attorney? Was that where we may have made that change?
Actually, our change wasn't per se as far as special state's attorney. It was actually changing in the language, which actually allowed the amending of just picking which property this is tied to, not having the whole document being amendable. That's what it was.
This separate from the IGA, a separate item as it was explained to me by the state's attorney's office is that it doesn't need to be part of the IGA, that the state's attorney said that the state's attorney was okay with having an assistant special state's attorney appointed to deal with this very limited issue. That's what I heard very clearly on multiple occasions. I didn't not hear that. I heard that multiple times. Mr. Boomer. Well, we've called the question. We have a motion to call the question and end debate. I'd very much like to give you the opportunity to speak, but we have a motion to end discussion. Do we have a second on ending discussion? I see no second to end. Oh, we have a second by Mr. Webster to end discussion. So the motion and the second is to end discussion and call the question. Any other discussion on that? Seeing none, I will ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote ends discussion. A no vote keeps the discussion going. Clerk, I'm out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is calling the question. Mrs. Red?
Well,
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster? Yes. Mr. Westcott? Yes. Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Bilich?
Yes.
Mr. Booker?
No.
Mr. Boomer? Yes. Mr. Butita? Yes. Mrs. Crosby? No. Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Girl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel? No. Mr. Hoffman?
No.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors? 12 yes. 6 no, 2 absent.
We've ended debate, so the item before the board will take immediate action on is to send it back to the Economic Development Committee, and with that, a yes vote sends it to committee, a no vote keeps it here. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Mr. Sandago is absent. Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Bilich?
No.
Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer?
Yes.
Mr. Butita?
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby?
No.
Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Girl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel? No. Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors?
Yes.
Mrs. Red? 13 yes.
We have 13 yes votes, so we will send that back to committee for more discussion. Next item, Mr. Billick.
All right, next matter of business for us is actually a resolution of the County Board of the Winnebago County of Illinois approving participation in the 2021 to 2026 Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, aka CEDS, for Northern Illinois region. And I so move.
Motion by Mr. Billick on the CEDS resolution. May I have a second? Mr. Girls on a second. Mr. Westcott's on a second. Item is now before the board. Any questions or discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next matter of business is a resolution authorizing a grant of $50,000 to the Village of Pecatonica for the replacement of street lights and light poles. And I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. Billick on the Village of Pecatonica, host fee request related to street lights and light poles. May I have a second, please? Yes, Mr. Booker, Mr. Westcott, and Mr. Gurl, all on seconds. We have a motion and a second on this item. Any discussion by board members? And if it's okay, we'll go to Mr. Booker.
Go ahead, Mr. Booker. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. As everyone knows, Pecatonica is in my district. Pecatonica has also been the host of the Winnebago County Fair for 100 years. The history of Pecatonica alone, the Civil War veterans, 2 buildings still exist out in Pecatonica that were involved in the Underground Railroad where slaves were running for freedom, were hidden and stored in those buildings and kept. And Pecatonica is also the home of Peck-Thing, twice a year, that brings hundreds of thousands of citizens to Pecatonica. Pecatonica saw a need to repair their streetlights for the main drag in downtown Pecatonica. They budgeted for it, they began work for it, and the way I understand it, our code enforcer informed them that the task that they were taking on involved a lot more money than what they had. They are now reaching out to the county for $50,000. Mr. Dornbush has put in a significant amount of time in helping Pecatonica work with Pecatonica and what they need. So they're not asking for an arm and a leg, and I strongly encourage board members to support Pecatonica and getting their street lights completed and accomplished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Booker. Any other discussion? I see a couple hands up. I don't know who was first, so I'll go Mrs. Gorel, then Mr. Webster.
Thank you. My question is, why are we doing a grant? Why are we not giving them money out of our host fees? First of all, we've done this before in some of our small villages. We don't do a whole lot to our small villages. And pardon?
This is out of the host fee. We're just giving them $50,000.
I understand.
The word grant is
asking
used,
for
but
a
it's
grant.
Yeah,
giving
we
them
use
the
the word grant, but we're just giving them
You're going to
$50,000 from the host
actually give-
fees.
Thank you. You just made me feel so much better.
They are not paying
Right, for
this
the-
back. If the board approves the dollars, it would be a $50,000 commitment allocation that would not be paid back by the village. I think that's a great question you asked. Mr. Webster.
Yeah, thank you. This I'm all in favor of because we, out of our host fees, as you know, and I've gone on about host fees forever, but out of our host fees, probably 90% of that money has gone to projects in Rockford and so forth. We rarely ever spread that money around the county. We forget that 50% of the county is not in the city, okay? And so I think it's important for us to do this. Several years ago, I won $50,000 for South Beloit, and also several years ago for Rockton, for another project. But since then, we've been lax about spreading any money around the county. So Winnebago, no, Cherry Valley, Milford, all of our smaller communities haven't really got much. So I'm very much in favor of this, so let's give it a green light. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Any other comments? And I'm sorry if I missed a hand up earlier on this side of the room.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir. Mr. Bellick.
Yeah, just for a point of clarification, yes, this is just a give. This is a one-time give. This is not a multi-year commitment. I apologize for not making that clarification earlier. This is not a multi-year commitment. There's no payback on it. It's just a one-time give. And to echo what Mr. Webster said, actually, this is wonderful municipality in our county that has been hosting a lot of events for us. Hosts one of the biggest Memorial Day parades within the state. Actually, I believe they're in like the top 3 or top 4, as was mentioned earlier. And honestly, it's just that's why we presented this ask. They did cover, I believe the total bill was $150,000. We're only covering $50,000 from that. So,
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Nice job, Mr. Dornbush, and many others.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes our business.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bellick. Next item of business, Operations Administrative Committee, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Operations Committee has got 3 resolutions before us tonight.
First, Mr. McDonald has the floor. Let's give everybody else a second, and then when they're ready, we'll give Mr. McDonald the floor. All right, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first resolution is awarding display cabinets for Veterans Memorial Hall, and I so move.
We've got a motion by Mr. McDonald on the awarding of display cabinets for Veterans Memorial Hall. Second, Mr. Westcott, Mr. Hoffman, Mrs. Gorel, Mr. Boomer. Item is now before the board for discussion and action. Any questions, comments? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Second resolution is urging the Winnebago County landfill to come into compliance with IEPA regulations, and I so move.
Motion by Mr. McDonald on the resolution by the board related to the landfill coming into compliance with EPA regulations. Several hands up. Be patient. Mr. Booker, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Hoffman, Mrs. Crosby, Mr. Fellers, and Mrs. Red. Several seconds there. So the item is now before the board. Any discussion?
I just have one amendment I'd like to make, Mr. Chairman. I would make a motion to replace the word urging with demanding.
We have a motion by Mr. McDonald to replace the word urging to demanding. Second by Mr. Fellers and Mr. Girl and Mrs. Crosby. Motion a second to make a one-word change. Remove one word and replace it urging and put in demanding. Motion a second on that one-word change. We're good on that. And then all those in favor of amending the motion to reflect that one-word change signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed to this change? We've amended the motion with this one-word change, and we'll go back for questions unless you had something you wanted to add, Mr. McDonald.
No, sir.
I'm sorry, I had a hand up. Mr. Kelly.
Yeah, this kind of goes along with what I was talking about during your chairman's report. I don't know what effect this will have, but I think the landfill has already caught wind of it because of the email I got today. We're hoping that maybe this resolution will help light a fire under the EPA. Understand they've referred the landfill's violations and Orchard Hills violations to the Attorney General. Hope we send a copy to the Attorney General too, so that maybe we can light a fire. Seems like it's been moving at a snail's pace as far as any enforcement action.
Okay.
So I encourage everybody to support the resolution.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. Any other comments on the resolution by the board related to the landfill about the EPA violations? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Kelly, for bringing that forward. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The final resolution authorizing communication with the Illinois General Assembly regarding proposed changes to the county code allowing counties to create and enforce a nuisance ordinance, and I so move.
Got a motion by Mr. McDonald on the communication with the General Assembly regarding potential changes to the county code related to nuisance ordinance. May I have a second, please? Second by Mr. Girl, Mrs. Crosby, Mr. Arena, and Mrs. Gorel. We have a motion and a second on the item now before the board. Any discussion? Mr. Fellers.
Thank you. I asked this question in caucus, and I apologize. I wasn't at committee to listen to it. Who are we authorizing, and what are we authorizing them to say?
Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The resolution does not name a specific person. It says a member of the Operations Committee. And we are asking that you allow a member of the Operations Committee to go to Springfield to help us gain traction with the trash and the littering down there.
I would just say on this, doesn't our ordinance already authorize the chairman of the Winnebago County Board to communicate and do these things, and can we just keep doing it that way?
It very well may, but I think there's power in numbers. If the chairman would join the member from the operations, I think that would be a terrific move.
Okay, I'd just like a little bit more specificity in my resolutions. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Mrs. Gorel. Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you. What type of nuisance are we talking?
I may defer to Mr. Arena. He's the one that worked with the State's Attorney's Office to get this drawn up so we can go to Springfield.
Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the Operations Committee had been having discussions with the Health Department about enforcement and the issue with trash blowing out of the trucks. The idea was discussed about having camera enforcement. In my conversation with the State's Attorney's Office, they questioned whether we have the authority to use cameras to enforce that aspect of our ordinance and suggested that we get it expressly included in state law that we may do so. And that's the specific intent of this resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. Mrs. Gorel.
Follow up on it. We have a lot of nuisance in Winnebago County. First of all, we also have sound nuisance. If you talk to anyone from the Sheriff's Department, in the summer on the river, they have a lot of problems with sound nuisance. I'm right, aren't
I live on the river and I agree.
Yeah, okay, and there's a lot of other nuisance that need to be taken care of. So if you're doing this for you should specify what type of nuisance we're talking about, so we know. In fact, I really thought this was gonna be for the Sheriff's Department. I didn't even think about it being for the landfill. So I would like to have a little bit more clarification on how we go to the state and get that done, because it does need to be done, but in more than just one aspect of not just trash, but of sound and other things. So I'm glad you are a first responder, so you know the nuisance that are out there too. Thank you.
I think I saw Mr. Arena have a hand up. You want to speak directly to this item just to bring any clarity? Mr. Arena.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I agree with Ms. Gorel. In preliminary conversations I had with, people that I deal with at the state level, they did say, we couldn't go down there and say we want a broad nuisance ordinance power, that would gain a lot of opposition. So if we want to amend this to specifically say nuisances related to litter caused by waste hauling vehicles, if everyone's more comfortable with that, that's fine. Going down there, that would be the actual thing we would try to address, not noise or everything else that would bring in too many other interests. So if you feel it's necessary to, okay, so then I would move that we include language in this to specify that it's nuisance related to litter caused by waste hauling vehicles.
Okay, thank you. So we have a motion by Mr. Arena to amend the language on the resolution itself to create and enforce a nuisance ordinance related to
Litter caused by waste hauling vehicles.
litter caused by waste hauler vehicles.
Right, we have that that's defined in our code now, I believe, by the last.
So nuisance ordinance related to waste hauler vehicles. That's the motion by Mr. Arena as a result of the discussion on the board floor. Second by Mr. Tassoni, Mr. Girl, and Mr. Butita. The amended motion is now before the board. It simply adds more specific language related to waste hauler vehicles. Any discussion, comments, concerns? All those in favor of amending the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. We've amended the motion to include that more specific language. Any other questions or comments by board members? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you. I do wish operations would look into sound too, because we're getting more and more venues into our county, all scattered all the way through in our unincorporated areas. So it wouldn't hurt to talk to the Sheriff's Department, see where they could do it. I understand we can't control cows and, animals and this type of thing, or farm machinery going on at night, those would be omitted. It would have to be actually nuisance. Too bad LC isn't still on our board, because he can tell you all the sound nuisance that came out of the two-wheel inn that he lived above, but he was on the city side and they were on the county side, and there's no regulations. So those are things that really operations, it would be good if you looked into with the safety committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gorel. Any other discussion? Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really do appreciate the thought that's been put into this. I would just warn about focusing too much on cameras, just because of the issues that have come out of Chicago with speed cameras and streetlight cameras, and them refunding lots and lots and lots of money to anyone that got pulled over for one of those because they don't allow for due process. So as we go down and we start having these conversations, just be sensitive that, enforcement of ordinance via cameras is a national issue, not necessarily a state issue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fellers. Any other comments? So we have an amended motion. Yes, Mr. Kelly.
One comment, we can talk about cameras, but you can't put them in the Orchard Hills landfill.
There we go. Thanks, Mr. Kelly. Any other comments? Seeing none, we got an amended motion that's before the board. All those in favor of approving the amended motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald.
That concludes the report. Thank you very much. Merry Christmas.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. Zoning Committee, Mr. Webster.
Thank you. Zoning Committee has 3 items for you tonight. These are all in for first reading. Z0819, Z1319, and Z1419. The first 2 are unanimous from both committee and ZBA. So if you wish, we could suspend on those 2. The third one will lay over till our January meeting.
Are you making a motion on number 1 and 2, Mr.
Yes.
Webster? Yes, you are?
Yes.
Okay, so we got a motion by Mr. Webster to suspend the rules on Z0819 and Z1319 to suspend. Second by Mr. Westcott and Mr. Tassoni and Mr. Billick. Thank you, and Mrs. Gorel. The motion is to suspend the rules, which will allow us to vote separately this evening. Any discussion on the motion to suspend the rules? Seeing none, all those in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We've suspended the rules unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Webster.
Thank you. I would move to approve items number 1 and number 2.
Got a motion by Mr. Webster on 0819, number 1, 01319, number 2. May I have a second, please, on this item? Mr. Westcott, Mr. Neighbors, Mrs. Gorel, and was there a hand up over here? Mr. Tassoni, thank you. Motion is second on items 1 and 2 under Zoning Committee. Any discussion on these items? Just quick, was there any conditions or no?
No, these are both map amendments.
Map
There are no
amendments.
conditions on map amendments.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any other questions? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Webster.
Thank you. That's all we have for now.
Mr. Boomer.
For the one that we didn't vote on, it's in my district, it's actually right in my backyard, and I don't know how it came out 6-1 and then 1-6, but like Mr. Webster said, I would, and like he always says, respect the representative in that district, and I don't see a problem with it at all, so hopefully everybody follows suit like what Mr. Webster says next week, or on our next meeting. That's it.
So, thank you very much, Mr. Boomer. And just
For the record, I think it was, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Go ahead.
For the record, I think the vote at ZBA was 4-1, and the vote at committee was 1-5.
1-5, okay. So this item has been laid over. This item in Mr. Boomer's district, it'll come back at the next board meeting. Mr. Webster.
Thank you. That's all we have. Merry Christmas to everybody. And by the way, thank everybody for the sock donations for Carpenter's Place. Sure, they'll appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Next item of business, Personnel Policy Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your Personnel and Policies Committee has one resolution to bring forward tonight. That resolution is authorizing the chairman of the county board to execute an agreement with WellSky Corporation, and I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. Fiducia on the resolution related to the WellSky Corporation, second by Mr. Hoffman and Mrs. Gorel. Item has been motioned and seconded and is before the board at this time. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll have a happy holidays.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. Public Works Committee, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have no report.
Public Works, Public Safety Committee, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. No report, and I would like to wish everyone a very merry and blessed Christmas.
Thank you very much. We have any unfinished business? Mr. Boomer, then Mr. Fellers.
I was going to say, everybody have a Merry Christmas and vote to adjourn.
We have unfinished business, then new business, then we'll vote to adjourn. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you. Quick question for Mr. Booker. Have we heard back from the state's attorney's office yet on the changes to the resolution regarding cannabis distribution and sales in the county?
No, I have not yet, and it appears that the state of Illinois is still finalizing the laws and regulations on the Cannabis Act.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Any other unfinished business? Moving on to new business. We have the resolution regarding the county executive on the November ballot. That's going to be referred to committee. That resolution is in your packet. With that, I do have a...
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Fellers.
Sorry, never mind.
We do have a request to go to closed session related to opioid litigation. Quick update, and since we're going to be off for multiple weeks, this is something we did want to get in front of you heading into a little bit of an extended break with only one board meeting in December. So with that, ask your courtesy for a motion to go to closed session. Mr. Hoffman, thank you very much. Second by Mrs. Crosby. All those in favor of going into closed session signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? We'll take a 1-minute break. We'll come back to a quick closed session for an update. Mr. Butita, I need a second. Mrs. Gorel. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Thank you very much. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, everyone.